Shocking, J.D. Vance insults Traoré and the ending leaves viewers unbelievable. The setting was the main studio of one of the largest American talk shows where J.D. Vance, the country's vice president, was about to make a statement that would alter the course of diplomatic relations between Washington and Ouagadougou. Under the intense lights of the cameras, he adjusted his microphone as the host asked him questions about foreign policy. It was a cold night in New York, but the heat of controversy had already begun to form even before Vance spoke his first words. The initial conversation was mild, touching on topics such as global economy and national security. However, when the host mentioned the name Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, the tone changed dramatically. Vance, known for his aggressive rhetoric and alignment with conservative ideas, didn't hesitate to launch a direct attack against the African leader. He claimed that Traoré was a threat to his own people, and accused him of being manipulated by hostile powers. The live broadcast captured every word, amplifying them to millions of viewers. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré watched the interview in silence, surrounded by nervous aides at his official residence. His face remained impassive, but his eyes revealed a mix of indignation and determination. He knew this provocation would require a firm and strategic response. Behind the scenes of the show, the American producers were already anticipating the global reaction to Vance's remarks. They knew the speech would be seen as yet another example of U.S. imperialist posture, one that always sparked heated reactions across the African continent. Yet no one expected the magnitude that Traoré's response would take in the coming hours. Meanwhile, in the United States, political analysts began debating the impact of Vance's words. Some supported his frankness, arguing he was merely defending national interests. Others criticized the lack of cultural sensitivity and the arrogance embedded in his statements. Among these critics was Sarah Collins, a renowned journalist specializing in international politics. Sarah, who had spent years covering African issues, felt disturbed by the superficiality of Vance's accusations. She decided to dig deeper into the political context of Burkina Faso and prepare a report offering a balanced perspective on the conflict. For this, she contacted an old friend, Michael Thompson, a retired diplomat with extensive experience in international negotiations. Michael agreed to collaborate with Sarah, explaining that the situation was more complex than it appeared at first glance. He emphasized that Traoré, despite his youth, had earned respect in the region for promoting economic reforms and fighting corruption. Moreover, he warned Sarah about the risks of underestimating the ability of African leaders like Traoré to respond, leaders whose rhetoric could expose Western vulnerabilities. As Sarah and Michael worked together, Vance continued to receive applause from certain sectors of the American media. However, the international climate was already beginning to shift. African leaders, activists, and even traditional U.S. allies started questioning the legitimacy of the vice president's criticisms. The world anxiously awaited Ibrahim Traoré's official response, which promised to be historic. The following morning, the government of Burkina Faso called an emergency press conference. Before a crowd of local and international journalists, Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the podium with calculated calm. He wore traditional Burkinabe clothing symbolizing national pride, and carried a folder full of documents he would use to back up his rebuttal to Vance's accusations. Traoré began his speech with a strong opening reminding the world that Burkina Faso was no longer the same country subjugated by French colonialism. He highlighted recent progress in areas such as education and infrastructure, contrasting them with U.S.-led military interventions in other African nations. His voice echoed with authority, making it clear he would not be easily intimidated. When addressing the core issue, Traoré tackled each of Vance's allegations point by point. He categorically rejected the idea of being a puppet of foreign powers, citing concrete examples of independent decisions made during his tenure. Additionally, he harshly criticized the history of American interventions on the African continent, recalling cases such as Libya and Sudan. The audience listened in absolute silence, impressed by Traoré's eloquence and precision. When he reached the part discussing the hypocrisy of America's democratic discourse, murmurs of approval spread among those present. He concluded his speech with a striking phrase: "The arrogance of power does not silence the dignity of a free people. The reaction was immediate. Videos from the press conference went viral on social media, generating massive support for the Burkina Faso president. Global activists began organizing demonstrations in several cities demanding respect for African sovereignty. Even European leaders, usually cautious about confronting the U.S., publicly praised Traoré's firm stance. In the United States, Vance's communications team panicked. They tried to minimize the damage by issuing generic statements about diplomatic dialogue, but it became evident that the vice president had gravely underestimated his opponent. Internally, discussions arose about how to control the narrative before the crisis escalated further. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins finalized her report, incorporating exclusive excerpts from her interview with Michael Thompson. She knew the article would be explosive, but she also understood the responsibility of delivering fair and informed analysis. Before publishing, she sent a copy for review to another key figure, Ahmed Dio, a Burkina Faso activist living in New York with direct connections to Traoré's government. Ahmed Dio, the Burkina Faso activist based in New York, received Sarah Collins' report with enthusiasm. He knew that the article had the potential to change public perception in the United States about Burkina Faso and its president. Ahmed was a man deeply passionate about his homeland and dedicated much of his life to promoting African causes in the West, especially within the diaspora. As he read the text, Ahmed made detailed notes suggesting minor revisions to make the narrative even more impactful. He emphasized the need to include testimonies from ordinary Burkina Faso citizens, showing how Traoré's policies were transforming real lives. Sarah accepted the suggestions and quickly adjusted the material, ensuring the report would be published. Before the end of the day, the reaction was immediate. Sarah's piece dominated headlines in major international outlets and was widely shared on social media. It highlighted not only Traoré's firm response, but also the historical context of U.S.-Africa relations. For many Americans, it was the first time they truly understood the African perspective on Western interventions. However, not everyone applauded the report. J.D. Vance, furious over the negative exposure, called an emergency meeting with his communications advisors. He accused Sarah of bias and threatened to sue her publication for defamation. Still, even his own allies warned him about the risks of escalating the crisis with another rash statement. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré was preparing his next move. He decided to organize an international conference on sovereignty and sustainable development, inviting leaders from African countries and other emerging nations. The goal was to build global support for his vision of a continent free from imperialist influence. The conference generated great interest, particularly because it represented an opportunity for Traoré to expand his diplomatic network. Among the guests was Michael Thompson, the former American diplomat who had been persuaded by Sarah to attend as an independent observer. Michael saw this as a chance to mediate possible future tensions between the two sides. However, behind the scenes, Vance's team continued pushing for a more aggressive response. Some advisors proposed economic sanctions against Burkina Faso, while others suggested disinformation campaigns to discredit Traoré. Vance hesitated, aware that any misstep could further worsen the situation. At that moment, it became clear that the confrontation between Vance and Traoré had transcended the personal level. Now it was a symbolic battle between two worldviews, one based on unilateral dominance, and the other rooted in self-determination and mutual cooperation. The stage was set for an inevitable climax. Traoré International Conference began in Ouagadougou with delegations from more than 30 countries in attendance. The event was broadcast live around the world, turning into an unprecedented political spectacle. Traoré opened the proceedings with an emotional speech reaffirming his commitment to African sovereignty and openly criticizing the exploitative model imposed by the West. Among the invited speakers, Michael Thompson stood out by delivering an objective analysis of the historical mistakes made by the U.S. in Africa. He spoke about failed military interventions, support for corrupt dictatorship, and the neglect of humanitarian consequences resulting from those actions. His speech was met with warm applause, reinforcing the legitimacy of the event. At the same time, pressure on J.D. Vance was growing in the United States. members of Congress began questioning his initial statements, demanding greater transparency regarding the government's foreign policy toward Africa. Even Republican allies called for moderation, fearing that the crisis could harm long-term strategic interests. Realizing he needed to act, Vance decided to grant an exclusive interview to a conservative news channel. He tried to justify his earlier remarks, arguing that they had been misunderstood and that his intention had always been to protect American interests. However, his defense sounded weak and unconvincing, especially after the revelations made during the conference in Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins followed every development closely, documenting each step of the conflict. She spoke regularly with Ahmed Dio, who provided insider information about Traoré's plans. Together, they realized that the decisive moment was near and that something needed to change to prevent a total collapse in relations between the two countries. On the fourth day of the conference, Traoré announced a surprising proposal: the creation of a development fund led by African nations aimed at financing infrastructure and education projects across the continent. He invited all global powers to contribute, provided they respected local autonomy. The initiative was hailed as a historic milestone. Back in the U.S., Vance faced growing divisions within his own party. Some senators began advocating for a diplomatic rapprochement with Burkina Faso, recognizing that the confrontational stance had caused more harm than good. It was a clear sign that the climax of the conflict was about to unfold. Traoré's proposal for an African-led development fund quickly gained momentum, receiving support from countries such as China, Russia, and even some traditional U.S. allies. The initiative was seen as a unique opportunity to promote genuine cooperation instead of unilateral exploitation. Meanwhile, in the United States, pressure on J.D. Vance reached unsustainable levels. The vice president called a new meeting with his advisory team, this time seeking alternatives to repair the damage caused by the crisis. Some suggested he issue a public apology, while others advocated for a more subtle approach, such as sending a high-ranking representative to the conference in Ouagadougou. After hours of heated debate, Vance finally agreed to adopt a more conciliatory stance. The following day, the State Department officially announced that Michael Thompson, the former American diplomat, would be sent as a special envoy to the event in Burkina Faso. The choice came as a surprise, since Thompson was known for his criticisms of the U.S.'s interventionist foreign policies. However, his experience and credibility made him the ideal candidate to attempt restoring relations. Upon arriving in Ouagadougou, Michael was personally received by Ibrahim Traoré. The meeting was cordial but marked by underlying tension. Traoré knew this was an opportunity to solidify his global standing, while Michael was aware of the importance of rebuilding diplomatic bridges. Both engaged in lengthy conversations about past mistakes and possible paths forward. During the conference, Michael delivered an unexpectedly sincere speech, acknowledging the United States' historical errors on the African continent. He emphasized that the country needed to change its approach, prioritizing partnerships based on mutual respect. His speech was met with a standing ovation, and many delegates considered the moment a turning point in Africa-West relations. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Sarah Collins continued to follow everything closely. She interviewed both Michael and Traoré, capturing exclusive details about the dialogues that had taken place during the event. Her reports became essential for understanding the political and symbolic impact of the conference, cementing her reputation as one of the most influential journalists of her time. J.D. Vance, on the other hand, faced increasing difficulties within the government. His initial stance had alienated important international allies and generated distrust even among his own colleagues. He began to realize that the lesson extended beyond foreign policy. It was about understanding the value of respect and humility in an interconnected world. In the final days of the conference, Traoré announced that the U.S. had been invited to participate in the African-led Development Fund, provided it accepted the terms proposed by African nations. The gesture was interpreted as a sign of goodwill, but also as a decisive test of America's willingness to change its historical behavior. The world anxiously awaited Washington's response. After weeks of intense negotiations, the U.S. government finally agreed to join the African-led Development Fund. The decision was announced in a joint statement signed by J.D. Vance and Ibrahim Traoré, marking the beginning of a new phase in relations between the two countries. While only a first step, the agreement symbolized a significant shift in how the U.S. engaged with the African continent. For J.D. Vance, the crisis served as a valuable lesson on the dangers of arrogance and lack of empathy in international affairs. He publicly admitted to having underestimated the complexity of the situation, and pledged to work toward avoiding similar mistakes in the future. Although some critics still questioned the sincerity of his words, the gesture was widely seen as a positive development. Ibrahim Traoré meanwhile emerged from the crisis as an even more respected global figure. His firm yet strategic rhetoric inspired millions around the world, especially young leaders seeking to transform their communities. He continued pushing reforms in Burkina Faso, ensuring the country remained at the center of international discussions on sovereignty and sustainable development. Sarah Collins published a book based on her reporting of the conflict, titled The Dignity of a Free People. The book became an instant bestseller, praised for its depth and impartiality. Sarah dedicated the book to Ahmed Diallo, whose collaboration had been essential in documenting the events in such detailed and impactful fashion. Ahmed in turn decided to expand his activism by founding an organization aimed at raising awareness about African issues in the West. He traveled frequently between New York and Ouagadougou, bridging different cultures and encouraging constructive dialogue. His mission was clear: to build bridges where there had once been walls. Michael Thompson returned to the United States as an unlikely hero, having helped mediate a diplomatic solution that could have easily spiraled into disaster. He was invited to speak at lectures and conferences where he shared reflections on the need for a more ethical and inclusive foreign policy. His voice stood as a constant reminder that the world was changing. In the months that followed, the Development Fund began operations, financing infrastructure and education projects across several regions in Africa. Early results were promising, demonstrating that partnerships built on mutual respect could generate tangible benefits for all involved. It was a model that could potentially be replicated elsewhere. On a quiet afternoon in Ouagadougou, Traoré reflected on recent events as he watched the sunset. He knew there was still much work ahead, but he took pride in the progress achieved. History is not written only by great men, he thought, but by those who have the courage to fight for justice and dignity. And so the chapter closed, making space for new challenges and achievements in a constantly evolving world.